Last Wednesday, Justice Jackson was laid to rest in a peaceful little cemetery called Maple Grove in Frewsburg. Doc Webster of the WJTN announcing and news staff attended the brief burial services along with hundreds of other persons. That night in a special broadcast, he said the following.
Good evening, friends. This is Doc Webster. Like many another citizen, I paid tribute today to the late Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson. The ceremonies in Washington and the trip to Jamestown are familiar to you, I'm sure. Justice Jackson's casket was taken from a Pennsylvania train in Warren this morning, brought here to Jamestown to lie in state at St. Luke's Episcopal Church at 4th and Main. It was shortly after 10 o'clock this morning when I joined the numbers in front of the church, and I learned that from the time the doors of the church opened, there had been an endless line of persons passing before the open casket to pay respect to the Frewsburg man whose career had brought so much pride to Western New Yorkers in all walks of life. The late Supreme Court Justice was surrounded virtually by a magnificent floral tribute from friends in this part of New York and Pennsylvania. An honor guard of members of the Jamestown Commandery Knights Templar stood silently beside the casket. I noticed a beautiful but small bouquet of yellow roses across the casket, and later found that this silent, vibrant tribute was from a very dear and unnamed friend of the late Justice. After moving through the church and back again on Main Street, the sidewalks filling with numbers of quietly conversing people, it seemed as though the spirit of deep reverence had followed out of the church and into the sunlight. Such was the mood of the assembled throngs that conversed in hushed tones on Main Street, on 4th Street. As the hands of the clock crept up to 11 o'clock and then started down toward 11:30, the number of persons increased on both sides of the street, and the line going into the church just continued to move its silent way into the door, past the casket through the church, and then out again into the bright sunlight of the morning. At 11 minutes past 11, the justices of the Supreme Court drove up to the church, immediately followed by Governor Thomas E. Dewey and his party. And as Governor Thomas E. Dewey, hat in hand, walked down Main Street to join the eminent jurists, it flashed quickly through my mind that man certainly is not measured by his physical stature alone. And as the group moved into the church, the sidewalks became more full, and the large crowd gathered as this important crossroads in Jamestown fell almost completely quiet. Promptly at 11:30, the brief services in the church started, and hardly more than 7 minutes later, the Knights Templar of the Jamestown Commandery formed outside the church. Family and friends filed from the church to waiting cars. The casket was brought out by members of the Jamestown Bar Association, with the justices of the Supreme Court as honorary pallbearers, and in an unbelievably short time, the long queue of cars started for Maple Grove Cemetery in Frewsburg. For the entire distance to Frewsburg, housewives came from homes to watch the entourage pass by. Filling station attendants stopped filling gas tanks. Motorists pulled to the curb, joining an already large number of spectators who had chosen vantage spots along the route earlier. In Frewsburg, at Maple Grove Cemetery, another large number of interested citizens awaited the arrival of the procession at the flower-covered grave. The flowers, I was told, had come from Washington Cathedral, where services were held yesterday. Chief among the floral pieces, a large cross of what I believe were white carnations from President Dwight David Eisenhower. And then short graveside services by the Reverend Lauriston L. Scaife, the Bishop of the Buffalo Diocese of Western New York, and the Reverend George F. O'Clay of St. Luke's Church, Jamestown. As I walked through the assembled throngs of people who come, and did come, of course, from all walks of life, the plain citizens, the public officials, the judges, the dignitaries, from the state of New York, from Pennsylvania, from the nation's capital, I heard soft-spoken accolades for this man for whom the services had been held. At the cemetery, I talked quietly with a bright-eyed gentleman of many years who told me proudly he remembered when the Jackson family came to Frewsburg. He told me how young Robert H. Jackson, as a youth of some 6 years, was a studious, serious, scholarly, quiet boy who just never seemed to be around when there was mischief afoot. And so it went. Memories of a boy that grew to manhood and became an idol of boys and girls and men and women who lived in western New York and Pennsylvania. A grateful populace here in western New York today paid homage to a neighbor who had come home to rest for the rest of time in the fall-garbed foliage of Frewsburg. Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson now goes to a reward that may recognize even more than those who knew and loved him his true greatness. Mortal man may forget this day, and the memory of those who stood as I stood today among those honoring the late Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson may dim completely. But for just a brief instant in eternity today, many of us saw the pen of history indelibly inscribe the name of Robert H. Jackson and then move on with the rest of the world. As that historical quill wrote, we all knew the name of Justice Robert H. Jackson would live forever.
Thank you, Doc Webster. There is very little more that can be said. We hope that these few moments this afternoon have been for you, as they have been for us, a fitting tribute to one of the greatest Americans ever to come from this Jamestown area, Robert H. Jackson.